I think what could be really valuable to the listeners is giving them an overview of what offshoring and what outsourcing really is, because I think in some ways we get a little bit confused between the two words and what they actually mean in today's day and age.
There are a few kind of key criteria that need to be met, or I would advise listeners and business owners to meet before they start to offshore things.
Well, we're back. We're back from holidays and trips and jet setting around the place. So it's good to be back. What was your thoughts on our in-person podcasts?
You did one without me.
Yeah, true.
Which was highly engaging for me. So I've never been more involved in a podcast than that one. So yeah, no, it was interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm.
I think the podcast with Jonathan was pretty cool. Just the most notable difference for me was how you get to read the room in terms of like vibe and where people are at and knowing when to interject and when not to, whereas it's quite hard to do that virtually. I think you feel way more emotion in person, which is interesting coming from somebody like me, because I'm so far on the spectrum. Emotion doesn't exist really.
You're not on the spectrum, are you?
And I think at one stage I just was weeping a little bit.
Oh, emotion as well.
When he was talking about, it could be the addiction stuff, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
can't quite remember that. But yeah, no, it was good. What about yourself?
Bit of a full podcast today. This one I'm pretty excited about, purely because it's the industry we're in, and I suppose it's also the industry we help a lot of business owners in, being outsourcing, offshoring. Yeah, I reckon we just dive straight in. Give us your overall view of offshoring and outsourcing at the moment. Like, how do you think of the industry? What do you think people think of the industry? Give us your kind of overall view of it.
It's a pretty strong question to start with, isn't it, really? There's no warming things up here.
No, straight in.
The
listeners need value, my friend. The listeners need value.
What do I think of offshore and outsourcing as an industry right now? Like, where does it kind of sit? I think I'd say over the 5 years that we've been in the offshoring industry, there has been an evolution that it's kind of become just way more received by SME owners, particularly. Obviously, we know the massive enterprises have been doing it for the last 20, 30 years. But I definitely think since kind of COVID kicked off and broke down these barriers to offshoring and the typical stigma around perceived quality of work, and it's hard to control and really hard to maintain influence with remote teams, I think all of that's kind of been quashed in the last 4 or 5 years. And as a result, we've seen way more business owners, be open to the idea of building teams offshore. And secondly, then, a massive uptick in business owners who are implementing offshoring as a tool, because that's what I perceive it to be, as a tool to enhance operations, grow revenues, improve profits, whatever else kind of falls in that category. But also, I think it's been quite interesting is as a result of those barriers coming down, there has been an evolution of people in the industry and service offerings have had to change and evolve and things like that. So that's quite interesting for those that see the industry as we do, that are also in it as well. Is kind of, there's been a massive evolution in the last 5 years.
Totally. I think what could be really valuable to the listeners is giving them an overview of what offshoring and what outsourcing really is, because I think in some ways we get a little bit confused between the two words and what they actually mean in today's day and age. So how I like to think of it is outsourcing is when you take a task, be it a project-based task or, a task that isn't really defined to a person, but more a function, and send that offshore to whoever wants to do that, whether that be and it's usually to a company who says, I will do your invoice uploading or I will do your bookkeeping. You don't really know who's doing it. You're just kind of outsourcing the task itself. So that's how I kind of define outsourcing. It be more project-based. It's more, doesn't really matter who's doing it. It just needs to be done. Bookkeeping is another really good one. Offshoring itself is more building a team, like you're having an individualized person that you've hired and screened and recruited who sits offshore to do certain tasks or do an entire role, whether that be an accountant or whether that be a graphics designer, a marketer, or, someone like that. You have a relationship with a single person who sits offshore. And I think it's important to understand that, because outsourcing itself is a good tool for some companies and some tasks, and offshoring and actually hiring offshore is, I think, a better tool and what we've seen better success in the industry right now. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. The anal alter ego in me probably would want to define them a little bit more transparently than you just did.
Okay.
This is without being an asshole. Because I think everything that we encompass falls within or underneath the umbrella of outsourcing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you've also then got to be able to compartmentalize between onshore outsourcing and offshore outsourcing, because they are viable pathways.
Mm-hmm.
We see that quite a bit in the States, where customer success stuff can be outsourced, but it's to another company in the States, or it can be outsourced to a company in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to align with what you said around what outsourcing is, it's definitely more output based than it is relationship personnel based. And then obviously you've got the world of like remote staffing, offshoring, which is where we kind of play, and it's providing dedicated people for dedicated roles, responsibilities to then drive kind of operations and efficiency, really. But yeah, I totally align with kind of your separation of what they are. And I think it is important that people do understand the difference, because it can become very convoluted. And, we see it when we talk to business owners where they think it's one thing and it's actually another thing.
Correct.
Or they're after one thing and that's not what we do. Then we explain what we do and they're like, oh yeah, that's a way better fit for what we want specifically. And then there are other instances, i.e., you alluded to accounting roles or like bookkeeping, social media roles, HR roles that do suit the offshore staffing model, having somebody dedicated offshore. But then there's the call center stuff that we've serviced where they're not really that fussed on who the person is. They just want the output, the service on the other side, right?
Correct. Two very different models, though.
Yeah, and both can be offshore.
Yes. Yeah. Which is kind of like where we sit. I think it's also important to make sure you choose the right model for what you're trying to achieve, right? And what would you say is the fundamental things that businesses need to get right in order to be to have a successful offshoring journey, or why would they go offshore to start with, etc.?
Yeah, this is something we've been trying to hone for the last 5 years, isn't it? To really understand why businesses take that step in that direction to begin with. I think there are a few kind of key criteria that need to be met, or I would advise listeners and business owners to meet before they start to offshore things. And that they're simple, but they're not easy. And things like, having operations and systems in place for things that could be offshoreable. I don't think that's much of a word, but it is today. Prior to shipping things offshore, I saw a post the other day, and it was all around like having problems within your business, and if you just choose to offshore the problem, it doesn't actually solve anything. If you've got this, archaic kind of invoicing process and you're constantly behind and you just think, offshoring it'll help. Well, it's not going to help if you don't fix why there's an archaic process in the first place, right? It's going to probably make it worse, because all of a sudden you've got people touching your process that fundamentally doesn't work in another country, different time zone, absolute chaos. So I think one of the critical fundamentals to ensure that the process that you want to look at offshoring actually works within your business currently, and then has the systemization, the playbooks to be able to hand it to somebody else to follow to get the desired outcome that you want, that has to be in place.
Yep. 100%. 100%.
I'd say that's probably the most important thing, because like for example, we've seen businesses that haven't had any process or systems in place try and brute force their way through offshoring because quote unquote, it's cheaper, it's easier to find someone. It kind of just isn't their problem anymore because it's been given to somebody else in another country. And it ends up an absolute shit show. And then you kind of tarnish the industry, you tarnish the experience, you tarnish this poor provider that goes out of the way to find shit hot talent because you don't have your processes in place. Like we do see that happen.
And I suppose it's also important to recognize the reasons that companies go offshore, right? Like, you know, and sometimes those drivers, be that cost pressure, be that, you know, requirement for extra resource, internal hiring structures not there or just takes ages to hire, not finding the right talent onshore, all those kinds of things, you know, offshoring can solve, but it only solves it if you've got the process in place to be able to, you know, have that person who's sitting offshore be a success. And we've seen the good, we've seen the bad, and we've seen the downright ugly when it comes to this. What have you seen or heard inside the industry or people we've talked to? And yeah, what's been the most amusing one, I suppose?
That it doesn't work.
This is actually such a good one you point to, because the amount of people we talk to who have heard of a bad, usually they say outsourcing experience. That's usually the word they use, right? I had a bad outsourcing experience. Someone hired someone from India, or they, you know, and they give you this extremely vague story of thinking that hiring someone offshore is outsourcing and that it failed and the person wasn't good at their job and all this kind of stuff. And then they say, no, it doesn't work, right? How many times have we heard that story?
Yeah,
and then they just chuck the whole idea of having an offshore staff member in the bin. It's fascinating.
Yeah,
absolutely fascinating.
And for some reason, it's always India.
Yeah, it is a common theme. And one thing that I'd say about it is, I think people think that going offshore is just easier. It's just this like idea that it's going to be easy. Oh, I'll just hire someone offshore. That'll be easy. And then you talk to them and it's like, okay, well, how many hours a day did you spend onboarding this person? And they say, talk to them every other day. Okay. And then you ask them, okay, well, how many SOPs did you hand over to this person? Didn't really have any. And then you ask them, okay, you know, how well did you vet the person before you hired them? The company just did that for me. I didn't actually interview. And you're like, okay, well, let's reverse the situation. Let's say you hired an assistant to sit in your office and you spent every other day with them and gave them one SOP and told some recruitment company just to tell someone to show up. How successful would that person be? And they look at you and go, yeah, that's an interesting kind of view of the situation. But it alludes to the point, like, just because you're hiring someone offshore and there is a cost benefit to that doesn't necessarily mean having that employee is any easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the quicker people can understand that building a team offshore is actually a complex task that requires a little bit of strategy and a little bit of process in order to achieve that cost benefit on the other side and massive output improvements. If you can accept that there's going to be a complexity because they are offshore, then you actually spend more time onboarding that offshore team and spending more time with them than you do your onshore team. And if people took that mindset, I think so many companies would have a better offshoring experience.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I think that when you said there are complexities, I was going to say that offshoring is easy, but it isn't simple.
Correct.
There are so many moving parts if you want to do it correctly and you want a team that is going to last more than 30 days and You want to find people that buy into your company culture and actually kind of integrate into the team. Like, it's not a simple process.
Not at all.
And I think that's why, it holds space for companies like ours who help to facilitate that process versus, hey, Josh, just go and jump on xybc.com and go and vet 10,000 people. Let me know how you get on. Like, there is a plausible credence for us to exist. And when you look at that circumstance overall around how ineffective it can be to onboard for 6 hours and then give them SOP 3 days later and maybe check in with them once a week and then complain that it isn't working. What would an efficient process look like to have somebody set up for success with offshoring? How would that be different to that very, weak kind of process that you just walked us through that is actually so right?
Yeah.
By the way, we see that so often.
Yeah, I think, for me, the key is the pre-work, right? So there's so many things that we do in the background in order to make sure we set a team up for success. So step number one, I think you have to make sure you know where this person's sitting inside your organization. And that's for an onshore hire or an offshore hire. You've got to know where they are, what they're doing, what's their KPIs, what are their job descriptions going to be, all those little things. What skills do you need them to have? They have to sit inside the org structure if you're going to offshore. Like, it's not just someone sitting out of the org structure on a little limb, with a dotted line saying contractor. You can't treat it like that. They have to be a part of the organization for multiple reasons. Like, one, building a culture. It's important that they feel like they're a part of something, especially if you go to the Philippines. It's a culture thing. And two, you've got to have reporting lines. You've got to have all those kinds of things that you would have if you had a normal onshore hire. So, it's important to do what you would normally do if you were going to hire onshore. Secondly, you've got to have the SOPs for them to step into, right? The companies that we've had the biggest or the best success with are somewhat the larger enterprises who have a very defined job role. They know exactly where they're sitting on the operation and they can see themselves kind of moving through the ranks, right? We look at, I'm not going to mention names, but we've got some pretty large New Zealand companies as some clients, and that's exactly it. They know where this person's going to sit, what they're going to do, what country they're going to look after, what time zone they need to work, and all that kind of stuff. And that's not to say that the typical SME owner it's not available to them. They just sometimes need to do a bit more pre-work in the back end to make sure that the person offshore is going to be successful in their role. So it's more the pre-work than I'd say the post-work. The recruitment side and the hiring side, that's where you leverage a company like us to do that for you and just present you with shortlisted candidates. But we can't write your SOPs. We can give you the frameworks to write them. We can't write them for you. So, but again, it's not uncommon. I think there's a movement, right? A movement of people who are recognizing that in the Western world, there's a skills shortage, there's a talent shortage, there's a entitlement building inside the workplace, inside the workforce that it doesn't exist offshore. And to get skilled workers to support, multiple functions within the business is not a hard ask anymore. It's actually very, very attainable. So the move there is more a movement than it is just an option or a tool. And somewhat, I would say in some companies, it's actually necessary to look at it as a strategy, offshoring as a strategy to basically survive.
Yeah. And when you have had conversations with, predominantly the upper management and businesses that are looking to implement offshoring, how much of a factor do you think it plays in the decision to offshore in having the onshore team buy into the process, be a part of the process, take to the process becoming a thing?